Thanks, Lou. It's always a pleasure to be here once again. And so let me organize my papers here. And well, the subject of this time's lecture is going to be Russia. And I don't know how many of you have attended, you know, a lot of these conferences, but I'll give a little bit history here. And I believe it was at the Ozark Symposium in 1990 that I gave a lecture about Russia. Just out of curiosity, I'd like to know how many of you might have seen that lecture. Raise your hand. Okay, so I guess it'll be new material for, well, in fact, the presentation that I'm going to give today is not going to be at all the same as the one in 1990. Of course, we have 9 years in between. But at that time, there was a lot of excitement about what was still the Soviet Union, because with Gorbachev and Perestroika and Glasnost, a lot of the, well, everything, life and culture in the Soviet Union was opening up, and including UFOs, which had been a subject rather repressed during the communist era. And so that was my first presentation that I gave about Russia. I believe later that same year, I also gave a presentation for the MUFON Symposium in Pensacola. And that paper you can still get through the proceedings. And later on, I published this book, which unfortunately is out of print now, the study guide in the USSR to psychic and UFOs and paranormal phenomena. And because, like I said, there was a lot of excitement about, suddenly there was a flood of new material coming out of what was then the Soviet Union. And then I remember that on the year after, in the Ozarks in 1991, thanks to my connections, we brought a Russian speaker here, Sergei Bulentsev, a man who was a senior correspondent at the TASS news agency, and he had been a close personal friend and colleague of Professor Ziegel, who is the godfather of Russian ufology, who passed away in 1988. And then to continue this little history of Russian ufology in the Ozarks, I believe it was on the year after, this would have been 92, I guess, or might have been 93, we screened here for the first time in the United States 2 Soviet Russian documentaries about UFOs done by my friend Dr. Vladimir Avinsky of Samara, Russia. One was called Planet of Aliens, the other one was called UFO Top Secret. Probably there might be some of you who saw that, but again, that was a long time ago. So that's a little bit the history. Of course, in lectures that I gave in subsequent years, I did touch briefly upon some update or other from Russia, but basically I haven't done too much lecturing about Russia since then. You know, like I said, I might have covered 1 or 2 cases. But this year, Lou had asked me to make some comments about that TNT show narrated by Roger Moore, the secret KGB UFO files, which I have quite a negative opinion about it, but we'll see some excerpts, and then I'll explain why I think that program was a hoax. And so I didn't want to spend an hour and a half talking about a hoax. I don't think that's what you people want to hear, although it's very important to clear the record, you know, and clean the barn and separate the good stuff from the bad stuff, because otherwise ufology becomes a muddled mixture of myth and reality, fact and fiction. And this is one of the big problems we've always had with ufology. So what I want to do in this presentation basically is to talk about, well, a little bit about the phony KGB documents and footage, and then mostly about the real KGB documents and the investigations done by the Soviet Ministry of Defense and the KGB, and which I wrote a long article in the current issue of the Anomalist Journal. It's a very good journal that comes twice a year. And this is about what's known as the Usovo case, which was a UFO incident that took place at this intercontinental nuclear missile base in what was still the Soviet Union. Now it's in an independent country, Ukraine. But back when this incident happened in 1982, that was certainly still part of the Soviet Union, still part of the Cold War. That was pre-Gorbachev. So basically, a lot of this presentation, you won't be hearing me, but you will be hearing Russian people themselves, and mostly retired military officers and KGB people talking from various documentaries, TV documentaries. I've done a montage of a number of shows. I'm sure some of you have seen maybe some of those shows, but I guarantee nobody has seen all of them, because some are very obscure, some come from Russia, and some are not even broadcast shows. They're just raw interviews with cosmonauts and officers. So some of these shows are in English, and I won't say anything, then you can listen by yourself. Some are in Russian, and of course those I will be kind of narrating what you're seeing. So we should get started soon, because we do have a lot of video clips, and then at the end we'll also be showing some slides. And I will be kind of guiding you through this presentation, telling you what you're about to see, and you know, what areas you should be paying attention, and so on. So the first, basically I've divided in 3 sections, well, 4 sections. If we have time, we'll see at the end a couple of more clips. But the main important sections will be the first section. We're going to see a few clips of UFO material dealing with the Russian space program and Russian cosmonauts. You'll see interviews with various Russian cosmonauts about either sightings they've had or you know, their own interest in UFOs, as well as some footage. Then on the second part, you'll see this infamous TNT show. Actually, it was produced by an outfit in Hollywood called Associated Television International. And of course, it's an hour-and-a-half show, and I've basically compressed it into about 10-12 minutes just to give you a flavor. And we'll be explaining, well, maybe a little bit through the viewing, but if not after, you know, what are the problems with that particular program. Then on the third part, we'll be basically dealing with the meat of the presentation, which is about the real KGB and Soviet military documents, including various excerpts from shows and interviews. But I'll explain more about that when we get there. So I think that we should start, so let's start with the videos. And the first one that you will see is an interview with this man, General Pavel Popovich. He's a very well-known Russian cosmonaut. He was part of the program, you know, from the start. And this is an interview that has not been broadcast. It was made by a Russian ufologist called Valery Yuvarov. And basically he's talking about his interest in the phenomenon. I have a copy here of a translation done by a friend of mine, Dmitry Osipov. And he's saying that I came to the conclusion, which I will gradually recite in front of you. First, I myself met only once something unexplainable in about 1978, when we flew from Washington to Moscow. And during that flight, I saw through the porthole. We flew at an elevation of 10,200 meters, and about 1,500 meters above us, we noticed a flying triangle on a parallel course. We flew at the speed of 950 kilometers per hour, and that triangle, which was equilateral, flew at the speed of about 1,500 kilometers an hour. He passed us, passengers and the crew saw it, and we were talking about, without coming to any sort of conclusion, it was a UFO. And then, of course, he goes on. He says he's a little bit skeptical about, and he has, you know, good reason about a lot of the stuff that it's put on TV and in the press and all that. And he said that his conclusion is that if you take all that was written and told as 100%, 95% you can reject. Most of those reports that either read about or they are looking for opportunity to be on TV or looking for fame. But 5%, it is definitely serious. And, well, it goes on. Now, the second, if we can now go to the second clip. And this is a very interesting, it's probably the most famous sighting by cosmonauts. It is known as the Kovalenov case. It happened in 1982. And this is from a Japanese program, but the reason I use this rather than the raw tape is because they had a rather nice animation of what Kovalenov saw from the Salyut 6 space station. And this is an animation of what he saw. And somewhere here in a bunch of papers, I have also what he's saying. And there again, basically what was interesting about this case was the change of shape of the UFO, something that the Russians themselves gave a name. They call it polymorphism. That's when a UFO breaks into various parts and then reunites. And again, he's finally, after Glasnost and all that, he went public and admitted to the sighting. Now next we're going to see from a program done originally by Channel 4 in England called UFOs Uncovered, which was recently shown on TLC for that Alien Invasion Week or whatever it was called. And we'll see later some other clips from that same program. It was a very well done program. It was a, you know, really journalistic program as opposed to entertainment. And you'll see here interviews with two Russian cosmonauts. One's called Musa Manarov, who also took some footage, and the other one is called Gennady Strekalov. So I think the footage should be coming out pretty soon. No? Maybe, oh yeah, this was just a repetition of the animation. Now, yeah, let's put the volume so people can listen. The Mir space station has allowed Russian cosmonauts to break the records for the length of time spent in space. During a docking with Mir, cosmonaut Musa Manarov filmed an unidentified object that passed by.
At some point in the filming, I caught sight of something that seemed to have separated from the ship. Moreover, it was rotating as it moved away and changing its brightness. I can't say exactly how far away it was. I can only say it was not very close, because the camera was focused on infinity. At first, it seemed to me that something has separated from the ship. But then, when I examined the ship, I realized that there was nothing that could have broken away. What's more, there were no alarms going off. Everything was calm. Later, there were lengthy arguments as to what it could possibly have been.
On another mission, Russian cosmonaut Gennady Strekalov is certain he saw an unusual, unidentified flying object in space.
There was a huge sphere. I think it appeared when we were over Newfoundland. The sea was in the background. It was shining, sparkling, of absolutely even shape. It shone like the balls that hang on trees at Christmas, greenish in color and all shimmering. It was impossible to take your eyes off it. I watched it for maybe 5 or 7 seconds, but I didn't have a camera, and if I'd gone to get one, I would have lost it. For just as suddenly as it appeared, so it just disappeared.
Okay, that is as far as the video oh no, we have one more, and this is an interesting one because this came, I obtained it here at the Ozarks after one of my lectures. I forgot the name of the person that had taped it on these NASA Select TV broadcasts, not TV, but you know, NASA Select they're called, you can get on some cable stations. And it was during the Mir Discovery Rendezvous mission, before they did the docking, when they were kind of, you know, getting training for that, for the final docking between the shuttle and the Mir space station. And this happened in February of 1995. And you will see, footage should be coming here pretty soon. And there it is. Now pay attention to this area. It will be very, very, very fast, but we will repeat it several times.
Well, we should have it.
So
Discovery, a magnificent picture, mirror crossing the horizon.
Obviously, this is a Discovery.
Well, we should have it on IMAX also, and
as they're approaching
we
the mirror.
certainly have it in all of our eyes. Yes, sir. Discovery for Eileen.
Okay, it's going to come shortly after this.
She's listening. Repress the right ohms for the B-regs, please.
It's all right, okay? But we'll repeat it
Roger.
several times for those of you that missed it.
She's listening. Repress the right ohms for the B-regs, please. She's listening. Repress the right ohms for the B-regs, please.
Roger.
She's listening. Repress the right ohms for the B-regs, please.
So what it is, I don't know, but it's certainly there, and it's a legitimate tape. To my knowledge, this has never been broadcast on TV shows, and I guess it hasn't been investigated. But so we owe it to this conference. That's how we got this material. If the person is here, you know, we owe him a big thanks, but maybe he's not here. Okay. So that is the section on the cosmonauts. Of course, there's much more stories. I got here a clip from a newspaper article about another cosmonaut called Baladin, Alexander Baladin, who I will, in fact, be meeting very shortly because after this trip in the Ozarks, in a couple of weeks, I'll be going to a big symposium in Chile, which is sponsored by two universities of Chile, University of Santiago and the Technological University, and also the Brasilia University, and it's going to be quite a serious thing. Besides myself, also from the United States, Dr. Bruce Maccabee and Dr. Richard Haynes will be going, and there will also be the famous Russian ufologist called Boris Sokolov, and who is a friend of this cosmonaut called Baladin, and he will be coming, and I guess we'll be talking about, I don't think he's had experiences himself, but certainly he's heard from his colleagues, and he will be telling us, I suppose, what's new. But for that, you'll have to catch me next year. Okay, so now we started on a high note. Unfortunately, now we're going to go on a low note, and this is this infamous TNT show. Of course, it was a very well-done production, very entertaining, narrated by Roger Moore of James Bond fame. But unfortunately, it didn't pan out at all. And so basically, I don't know how many of you saw this program on the TNT. Raise your hands, those of you who saw it. Okay, not that many, but some. We were all excited, of course, that it could be real, but the more we looked at it, that was not the case. Unfortunately for me, I was part of that program, but of course I didn't know at all about the footage and what these people were cooking. Basically, George Filer, and who's a MUFON member of the board from New Jersey, director of investigations, and myself they flew us to Los Angeles, put us in a very nice hotel. Then they interviewed us for a long time, but they didn't use practically all of that footage from the interview. I guess basically what they wanted was to show us this footage and to catch our reactions. But we didn't know anything about the program, so basically it was our first impression. And okay, so if we can see this, this of course is in English, but I will be paying your attention to some significant discrepancies and problems with this program. So let's go to the next.
From another world may have visited our own is an intriguing one. Many say that
It is true, and that documentation exists to prove it, but that proof has been kept hidden from the public for over 50 years.
And everything, but it was really a terrible show, and it deserves it because it's a type of show that presents something as real when it's not. Now, I will begin in this quick montage I did with first some alleged footage taken from Soviet aircraft.
Obtained by a group of Russian ufologists. It was declassified by the USSR's Ministry of Defense just before
it looked very good, but first I thought this part of the film might have been real, but later, after seeing the rest of the program, I also have my serious doubts.
What we see now is
it's just too good to be true, and also there is no background about this thing. Nobody's ever heard of it before the show or after the show. And they claim this is declassified Soviet footage, yet any of you who have dealt with declassified documents in the United States, Spain, anywhere in the world, there's always a lot of correspondence when you get declassified material. So you can always prove that you did get this from the government, whatever government it is, because you'll have the cover letter saying, you know, we're hereby enclosing, you know, this footage of these documents. And these films, the narrator Moore was very vague on the script. All he said it was declassified material obtained by a Moscow group. Well, that's pretty vague. What group in Moscow, when it was declassified, etc. Also, you notice the quality of the planes is very, very clear. So what I think this is, I think these are promotional films, you know, for selling aircraft, right? I mean, even in the communist days, the Soviets had a big business of selling aircraft to India and their allies and so on. And that's why it's so clear. And then it was just retouched and added the UFOs. Then all throughout this show, you had these shadowy figures. Colonel VM, Agent H. Some were alleged to be Soviet intelligence, others American intelligence, but they were not identified. And yeah, of course, in the old days, you would have said, yes, it's very hard to get a Soviet military guy going on record. So you would expect that if you got him, he might be with his face covered. But this doesn't, I'm afraid it doesn't work anymore, because after we see this program, we're going to see like 20 tapes of even generals all speaking on the record, using their faces, using their real names, and so on. This is another of the alleged UFO footages. Now, one of the secret informants for this program, the one known as Agent H, which was quote, authenticating this Soviet KGB footage, which you'll see later, the one about the crash saucer and the autopsy. A friend of mine from Hollywood, who was in fact the guy that had made the connection with Associated Television, so they gave them my phone number so they could interview me. Turned out that he had seen this guy, Agent H, as an actor hanging around the Associated Television studios. So much for that guy. Okay, this would have been the key witness in the whole program. A supposed Soviet ufologist called Vereshchagin, who had written a book about this crash in Berezovsky, in this place in central Russia. But of course, Russia is a very big country. I had never heard of Vereshchagin, but I thought, well, maybe someone else did. Maybe the guy does exist. Maybe the book was published. I mean, I had to at least give it a good faith. But as time went on, it turns out that Vereshchagin doesn't exist. I mean, I've received correspondence from Shurinov and from many people, and there's no evidence that such guy existed, that book was published. There's just nothing. This was supposed to be a local newspaper clipping in this Sverdlovsk newspaper from the time of this incident, around 1968, which talked about the crash. Didn't say it was a UFO from outer space, but talked about some mysterious lights that had been seen. And this was rather anomalous because at that time there was a lid of censorship on UFOs in general in the Soviet press. So this was unusual. So I thought if we could locate this clipping, and it's a real newspaper clipping, then maybe there is something to the story. But that didn't pan out either. And a Russian guy from New York, he's Russian, but he's moved in New York, who was not at all involved in ufology, called Alex Heffman, initially got terribly excited about this show and made a website and everything, and he believed it was real. It was interesting because he had no background whatsoever in the subject, so he started with a very fresh approach. Yet, the more he dug up, the more he found out that nothing panned out. And after tremendous effort, he did locate copies of the newspaper in that city for that date, and of course there was no UFO article. And you also notice in the show that they kind of never show the whole newspaper. They kind of zoom into the clips. Well, this is the alleged footage, part of the footage. You notice that it is very clear. There's basically two types of footage. One shows the disc, the crash disc, and the other one shows the autopsy. This is the KGB seal. Here's the autopsy part. I guess, you know, given the success of the Santilli film, they wanted to repeat it, I guess. But it wasn't so successful. It didn't have at all the same impact as Santilli. But unfortunately, maybe in this country, people have gone a little bit more savvy after the Santilli fiasco. But in Chile and South America, this show now has been broadcast, and it's caused a lot of problems. You know, a lot of people thought this is real, and they've made comments, and they think it's great, and so on. So this is what this type of program is very, very unhelpful. Unless it was real, of course. This is, some people were referring to this creature as the turtle. Looks kind of like a turtle without the, you know, the covering. Now, there are still more problems about this, and I'm not even going to deal with the technical aspects of the film. That's not my area of expertise. I figured that if we could verify Vereshchagin and the newspaper clipping and some of the documentation, then maybe there was a chance that this footage was real. But since all of the accompanying documentation completely fell apart, then of course people noticed that it was very curious that the trees right next to the disc are in excellent shape. They didn't get broken. So that was a problem. Another problem, which was of all people, was suggested by Phil Klass, but he had a good point. He said, well, are the soldiers guarding, you know, anything that's going to come from the saucer or guarding the public, you know? So he said, if they're guarding the public, they would be facing out and doing a perimeter. He said, but that doesn't make good TV. And he had a very good point. Now, the other thing that you have to keep in mind, that with the economic situation in Russia, I'm pretty sure, and this, in fact, Alex Heffman did locate some people that had worked on this hoax, apparently, in Moscow. But he had gotten some threatening letters from lawyers from the Hollywood studio, so he got very scared and he wouldn't reveal the names of these people. But the assumption is that this was, let's say, concocted in Hollywood, but produced in Russia. And of course, with the economic situation in Russia these days, you could do this very cheap. Here would probably cost much more money, but you know, to rent military jeeps and military uniforms and hire some actors, and you could do, I don't know, $10,000 probably done. You know, consider that some people in Russia make $100 a month, so you pay them $20 to hang out a day, you know, and rent a KGB uniform or something, which you can buy in the open market. This was a very facetious scene in which the Russian mafia supposedly is selling these KGB documents, which confirm perfectly the case to the TV producers who are filming this. And I think to try to film the Russian mafia, unless you are part of a, you know, an Interpol, sting operation, I think you'd be crazy to try to play those games with the Russian mafia. I wouldn't recommend it.
You see, of course,
So again, this could be done very quickly just stage it. This is supposed to have been the top dog there, the KGB officer in charge.
Disinformation too, that the KGB was quite notorious about doing disinformation. For what purpose, I don't know.
Oh yeah, this is what I'm talking. I just wanted to put it here for the record. But maybe let's put it a little louder so people can see exactly what I said.
Disinformation aimed against Americans, or something we never heard of it.
Backtrack a little bit so we see the whole statement.
That's also dubious.
But again, you have to bear in mind that I had no idea what I was seeing. I mean, it was a typical TV ambush, you know, where they put this footage in front of you and say, well, what's your opinion? And you have no information.
Offered us his views on the film.
I would say that visually it's very impressive. The first thing that struck me was the good quality. A very, very, very clear, footage. You see, of course, it wouldn't be possible to duplicate, you know, as a hoax. You would have to hire some actors and so on. But it was quite well done. Of course, it could even be some kind of disinformation too, that the KGB was quite notorious about doing disinformation. For what purpose, I don't know, but they might have done some kind of training film or something to... Of course, if it was disinformation aimed against Americans or something, we never heard of it. So that's
nobody ever heard of this crash before.
Finally, while Mr. Hernandez felt that the film required more investigation, he was impressed and intrigued by it.
Well, I would say that if this is real, and I do not have the elements to make that judgment, this is so far the best footage of an alleged crash UFO or a dead alien that I've seen so far.
See, in the beginning of the program, they used that clip, but they took the part that it says, if this is real, and they just said this is the best footage. Typical dishonest TV editing. And of course, those of many researchers here that have done TV programs, after they film you, you have no control whatsoever. They can manipulate you whatever they want. This is the one witness which they give his name. I suppose one of the KGB members had participated in this operation. And all they say, he lives in the Bryansky region of central Russia. Well, good luck trying to find him. I mean, if they had given, you know, the exact city where he lived or something, but Russia is a big place, as you know. These are the documents. I never saw any kind of independent analysis of these documents. And it was too lucky for these guys if this was true. I mean, everything, they had witnesses, they had documents, they had the footage. Everything fit perfectly, too perfectly.
Requesting assistance from military...
And again, like I said, we had never heard. There are certainly some other accounts of alleged Russian crashes, and some are not even alleged. There are cases like Dalnegorsk, where metal pieces exist and have been analyzed. And that was the shame of this program, that they could have concentrated on the real stuff from Russia. This is when they locate the medical lab where now this is a key part to show that this is a hoax. See, you see the death certificates there, because they claim that the three doctors that did the autopsy all died of a mysterious heart attack shortly after. And if you notice in the beginning, they show a seal of the death certificate. Well, Boris, sure enough, for unfortunate reasons, but some relative of his had died about the same year when these doctors supposedly had died. And I have a copy. I didn't have time to make a slide or anything, but I can even show it to you on my table. I have a copy of the death certificate from that time. And of course, this one was on the Soviet period. So he had the seal of the Russian Federation. Well, it wasn't called the Russian Federation. You see, it was called, in those days, it was called PCCP. Russian Socialist Soviet Republic. And so the death certificates from that era had the seal and then PCCP. Yet the documents that they obtained for this show, you couldn't see the PCCP, only the seal, which means they were documents taken from Yeltsin's Russia, because any document from the Soviet period would say Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. So that was another nail on the coffin. And I guess that's it. I can go on the prominence of this thing, but it is. I don't think, as I said in the program there, I didn't know at the time. They were showing me this for the first time. I said, well, maybe it is disinformation. The KGB was certainly notorious for disinformation, but now I don't think that either. I think that it's basically a hoax done for commercial purposes, and and presented as fact. Very similar, in fact, to this other atrocious show that was shown, I think last year, about an alleged abduction in Minnesota. Same type of thing, you know, but it's very disingenuous because you really confuse the waters of an already confusing field, and we don't need Hollywood to come and make things worse. But when they do, we have to be sharp and denounce it. So basically, there you have it. This is extraordinary. I mean, I myself have talked to generals from Belgium, General de Brouvier in Belgium, with General Vega, former commander-in-chief of the Chilean Air Force. And, you know, you'll find many high officials over the years in different countries who have admitted that UFOs are real, or that a particular UFO incident did take place. That you can find. And they will say that it was unexplained, and it was perhaps not a secret test. They'll go as far as there. But to say that they concluded that it was an extraterrestrial civilization, an alien civilization, that is kind of a new thing to go public, I mean. This report, which unfortunately has not been released, but certainly we do have the statement from the general, very similar in some ways to those of you who are familiar with the American Air Force UFO history, to the so-called ghost estimate of the situation done in the late 40s by the Project Sign people, which I guess it was around 47 or 48, way back, when they allegedly did this, according to the book by the Captain Ruppelt of Blue Book and other sources from that time. Apparently they did do a report, an estimate of the situation for the Joint Chiefs that concluded that UFOs were probably extraterrestrial. And this went all the way up to General Vandenberg, who was the head of the Air Force at the time, and he ordered all copies destroyed. And to this day, no one has ever seen that report. We only have the testimonies that it existed. So, kind of similar, of course, 50 years apart and different countries and so on. But the difference with this one is that this general is going public, as you can see, saying that that's what he thought it was. Like I said, we haven't seen the report. But I think I've made my point by all those interviews and former officers, generals, KGB people, etc., how hokey the TNT show looks in comparison with all those people with blacked out faces and so on. Here you saw a collection of people, everybody speaking on the record with their real names and so on. Well, I had a couple of more videos, but I think that we'll rather move to the slides because I may be running out of time here, and I did want to show a few slides. So if we can switch what I just pressed here. Okay, so I wanted to show this. I have shown it in the past. I remember one time I gave a lecture about UFOs in history, but at that time, hardly anybody in this audience or anywhere else knew where this thing was. Or, I mean, I told them that this was in southern Yugoslavia in a particular province called Kosovo, but it didn't mean anything to anybody in those days. I don't think I have to explain now where Kosovo is. So this is the famous Dekani Monastery. It's one of the holy places of the Serbian Orthodox Church, and it is from the 1300s, late medieval period. And of course, here's the crucifixion. You got that object there, that object there. Now, we'll see blow-up, so don't worry. Here's the blow-up of the first one. And the second one is even more exceptional. No, I went backwards. There. This is medieval times. There was no balloons or anything else that flew, I mean, man-made in those days. And if you remember the whole fresco in this monastery, I mean, if the painter wanted to do angels and religious figures, he knew very well how to do angels. This is not an angel. It doesn't look like an angel, and it doesn't fly like an angel. And so what is this, you know? What the hell is this object? So I thought it was good that you see it. Because and I'm not going to take here much of a position about the war or anything, but when you do the comments that you've heard that this part of I think these monasteries are on the northern part of Kosovo, and when you hear that this area is like the Jerusalem for the Serbs, yeah, that is true. That's where all their most sacred monasteries and the cradle of their Orthodox Church is located. This painting came up, I guess it was first published many years ago in the 60s. It was published in some of the early papers about paleocontact or ancient astronauts from Russian authors. And there was a little bit of analysis done, but I've always wanted to see it, but I don't think now is the time to go see it. Okay. So that's as far as Kosovo goes. Now, briefly, I wanted to show here some artwork from various Russian cases. There's a concept of seeding, UFOs seeding the Earth. Actually, this is from the 60s, and it's from a science fiction book, so it's not about real UFO incidents. But obviously, they're perfect saucers. And maybe that was a way, in fact, in the early days of Soviet ufology, when that was a very repressed subject. One of the ways that people had to discuss the subject was in science fiction clubs, because science fiction was big in the Soviet Union, and they used to meet at science fiction clubs, and then they would exchange notes about UFO cases and so on. But of course, they couldn't publish it, not in those days. Here's some more artwork. This is supposed to be one of the renditions of the famous Voronezh landing of 1989, which I remember that was the hot subject when I gave my lecture 9 years ago. This was the Samara Triangle from the collection of Dr. Avinsky, very, very similar to the Belgium Triangle, and it also happened about the same time in the 1990. Here's the late astronomer, Professor Felix Ziegel, with one of his books on astronomy. And he, by all accounts, he's the undisputed father of Soviet ufology. Unfortunately, he died away, ironically, just as the subject was opening up in 1988. So he never got to see the big commercialization of Soviet ufology. But because he was an astronomer and a professor at the Moscow Aviation Institute, he was able to actually conduct UFO research, but not to publish it. In fact, his papers were all published in samizdat form, in underground as mimeographed copies, and eventually they went all over the world, but not sanctioned, with the exception of a few articles that were published officially. But later, Dr. Richard Haynes did compile some of the volumes of Dr. Ziegel, although they're not available commercially. A few photographs. These are some old photographs from the Soviet period. This was taken in Azerbaijan, which was a republic, part of the Soviet Union, now independent, right next to Iran. This was a photograph that also came from the dossier of material that George Knapp brought back from Russia, but it was not from the Ministry of Defense investigation, but from the Academy of Sciences investigation, which were kind of joint, but in fact we knew, the Western ufologists, we knew about the Soviet Academy studies, because as far back as 1979, a statistical report had been published in the Soviet Union, and then it was translated by NASA and distributed by KUFOS. So we knew about that part of the UFO investigation, of course, not all the details. Communications were very, very difficult with people in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But we knew that something was going on. But what was totally secret was the military aspect of the investigation. And this, the military commissions, which you just saw from the various video clips, and this we didn't hear until the late Glasnost period, and even later, like after the fall of the Soviet Union. This was another hoax of alleged UFO crash in Azerbaijan, also in the Caucasus area. And it made the round of all the UFO magazines around the early 90s, but it turned out to be a hoax. Well, originally it was not a hoax. What it was a prop for a Polish science fiction film. So it was not meant as a hoax, but it was, when it was published as a real UFO, you know, that was either by ignorance or by lack of research. People thought that it was real originally, until the director of the Polish film saw it, I think in a German magazine or whatever, and said, wait a minute, that's the prop from my film. So he wrote a letter to Michael Hesseman, and that's how that story came public. But as usual, there was a whole tale about a mushroom farmer that got contaminated, and this was supposed to have been caused by this UFO, and blah, blah, blah. And those are the actors, and I guess maybe that's why they put the strip, you know, so they wouldn't be identified. I don't know. That was probably done when this pictures were published in UFO magazines. This was the famous 2 photographs from the Phobos probe to Mars. And I'm not going to go too much into that, but they're quite well known. That one was the one, the shadow over Mars. And this is the moonlet of Phobos itself. And that was the UFO, which according to some estimates was very, very large, something like 25 kilometers, like 15 miles long. But of course that is hard to estimate because it will depend how far the object is from the camera of the probe. And then what made this case famous is that shortly after this, in fact, that was the last photograph that was taken by this probe, and later it malfunctioned under somewhat mysterious circumstances, and that's what the last we heard of that particular probe. But later on, the pictures were released. This is a picture that was published in the Soviet Military Review in a very famous article, because it was an official publication of the Soviet Armed Forces taken in the Caucasus area somewhere in the mid-'80s. But we don't know much more details about it. Now some of the various documents that we talked about through these various video clips. Just the sketches by the witnesses, all this from the files brought by George Knapp. Well, actually, this came from a different file. This is the Kapustin Yar case of July 1989, and it's also part of the same dossier, basically, but this was obtained differently. Basically, this was officially declassified by the KGB in 1990 and released to General Popovich, the cosmonaut. And from there, it went to various Western ufologists, and I got hold of some of these documents. And in fact, this case was very interesting because it was another case of a UFO over a nuclear and a missile base. Kapustin Yar is the equivalent of White Sands, is where a lot of the missile testing is conducted. And there you see the artist's rendition where the UFO was hovering right over the weapon storage area, almost identical to a case that happened at the Loring Air Force Base in Maine in '75. And we did have all the depositions for this case, also from various officers. And this became one of the incidents that we used in the UFO briefing document, the best available evidence, that I was one of the co-authors with Don Berliner. Now, this is the document by Major Kataman Davidovich and here, that are the codes. And that's the part where he's explaining that these 4-digit codes were lighting on and off like some sort of a Christmas tree, totally out of his control. And so this is his official deposition. And here's the seal. This is an English translation of the same document. And this is all contained in my article in the Anomalist. These are some of the other depositions about the same incident in Usovo, including some of the sketches. These are by the officers who saw the lights outside. Now, we've talked a lot about UFOs and in pilot cases and some footage and things seen by cosmonauts and all kinds of things, but all UFOs. We haven't seen much about aliens and humanoids. So I figured that at the end of this presentation, at least I'll cover that briefly. Of course, we don't have too many documents. And this is typical. It was the same thing with Blue Book. Out of 13,000 cases or something in Blue Book, only 7 dealt with close encounters of the third kind. So, and then the same thing happened in China when UFOs opened up, and this is something I mentioned in previous lectures here. When UFOs opened up in China around the period where, in the late 70s, when China opened up, you know, to the capitalist system and the society opened up to some extent, for the first time people could talk about UFOs, but they were only mentioning lights in the sky, spiral-shaped objects, all kinds of objects hovering, moving, being chased by airplanes. But you didn't hear much about aliens and abductions and contact cases and so on. And now, later in China, you did hear some. So this seems to be a pattern. I guess it's like the human mind can take so much information at a time, and it has to go by steps, you know. And so an object in the sky is less controversial than an alien in your bedroom. So you first go on the first step, then you go to the next one. So, but, and the same thing, of course, was in Russia. Even in the 80s, at the time of Leonid Brezhnev, the so-called period of stagnation, actually it was a good time for UFO research. That's when the Soviet Academy studies were going on. And because ufology was sort of a banned subject in the media pretty much, and it was certainly not a commercial subject in Russia, people were very sharp. A lot of people involved were scientists, and they were being very scientific in these reports because that was the only way where they could present their findings, by being very, very carefully and very scientific. Unfortunately, after Glasnost and all that, came the tabloidization of ufology in Russia. So even though on the one hand it was a good thing because it allowed a lot of material to come public and people who had been in the military and the KGB to speak publicly and so on. That was the good side of it. But the bad side of it was the tabloidization of Soviet ufology or Russian ufology. People wanted to make money, hoaxes, silly stories, and so on. But together with all that process also came all the stories now for the first time being published in the media and so on about aliens. That's why the Voronezh case was so important, because it was sort of the first case. Well, there had been a few cases before, but it was the first case who got huge attention, both locally in Soviet Union and internationally, which involved a C-3 with aliens and everything. It was the first time that this was being given a big play. Now, this is the case of a guy called Malishev, who is an abductee, who, in fact, we do have some of his paintings in my calendar. And he was also a painter, so he did some rather nice illustrations about his experience. This is the other one. And I want to read you here something from the caption of my calendar, because this case actually was investigated by some of the military people, not at the time it happened, but later apparently. The case happened in a place, a rural suburb of Moscow known as Solzhenitsyn, in the afternoon of July 21, 1975. Now I'm quoting from Malishev's statement. "They look at me very attentively, blinking seldom, which made their look more perspicacious," wrote Malishev. "They didn't take their helmets off." Yeah, here we have a close. Oh, okay. That's when first the UFO lands. Now they're coming out. "I heard the voice of pleasant timbre not clearly. I heard the Russian speech not with my ears, but with the back of my head," which is very common in cases involving UFO communication. Very rarely you do hear sound, actual vocal sound, although a few cases exist of that sort, but the great majority is just heard telepathically in the language of whichever country happens. So if it's a Russian guy that's having an experience, he'll hear the alien speaking in Russian. If it happened in Mexico, he will hear it in Spanish. If it happened here, it will be in English, and so on. Then Malishev was, here we have the close-up of how the aliens looked. Malishev was taken inside the UFO and then to other planets. Well, perhaps to other planets, or perhaps he was shown some kind of interactive scene of what looked like other planets, some kind of virtual reality. That's my opinion, but we don't know what happened to him exactly. And then later his case was investigated by doctors and officials from the Soviet Ministry of Defense, who concluded that, quote, he is very honest, kind, sympathetic, with absolutely no fantasy, because apparently they subjected him to psychological studies and so on, and of course, if he was making up, he would have had enormous fantasy. So it's considered like one of the best abduction cases from Russia. These were the giants from Voronezh that they were very, very bizarre, and they had no necks, and they were almost like the exact opposite of what is reported in the United States, which mostly we have grays here. I don't like to call them grays because some are white or brown or whatever, but okay, that name has stuck, so now everybody's using it. But basically here, people are reporting, you know, although they're reporting other entities as well. But the more typical one is, I don't have to tell you guys, you know, of course, the humanoid, you know, the guy with the big head and a small body. And these exactly the opposite, very tall body and very small head. So, I don't know. Oh, there must be a problem with the slide, so we'll just keep it. This is another one from the Samara region. Notice that it has some things reminiscent of folklore, like a ball and a wand. And this other wearing a helmet, which is in some kind of breathing apparatus, which is not common these days, but you'll find some cases, especially in the early days of ufology in the 50s and so on, of some so-called alien entities with breathing helmets too. And this sort of the Russian version of Mothman. Remember Mothman, this winged creature from West Virginia, among other places, but mostly in West Virginia. And now some of these paintings, I don't have the full details. So this actually may be even a Russian artist interpretation of the American Mothman. I don't know that he's talking about a Russian incident, but it's certainly the painter is Russian, and he came from my collection of Russian graphics and pictures. And this, the more standard guy, you know, the more typical so-called gray, although a little different, taller, but certainly you can see a little bit more the similarity from a case involving some students camping, I believe in Kazakhstan or someplace like that, and they saw it outside their tent. And that's as far as the slides go. Well, the planet Earth, and of course what's interesting about UFOs, or one of the things that is interesting about UFOs, is that they get reported everywhere. They're not exclusive to any country in particular. Now the main question is whether we're dealing with different types of aliens, and these different types of aliens are interacting in different parts of the world. I think that's a possibility. You know, sort of reminiscent during the Cold War when the Americans and the Russians had, you know, their areas of influence in Africa and Latin America and so on, and they were competing for territorial thing and using underlings in other countries. Maybe there's something similar going on with aliens, in which different aliens have certain turf in certain parts of the world. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is we're basically dealing with the same phenomenon, but it gets filtered slightly different according to the different cultures. And I think there's something that can be said for that theory as well. There's a famous picture of some aliens seen in southern Argentina in forgot which year, late 60s or something, in which they're wearing a poncho. Now, aliens I don't think wear ponchos, but South Americans do. So maybe people are seeing something nebulous, and that is there, but it's not maybe clearly defined, and they are adding things from their own culture. I mean, without trying, you know, subliminally. That's also a valid argument. But we don't know the final answers, and if we knew, we wouldn't be here. It would all be done and over, and that's why we're here. And so there is still much more to go, but I think that the main thing to keep in mind is to always try to keep the material clean, get rid of the stuff that is useless, and that's very important, because otherwise we end up with the confusion of fact and fiction. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of ufology has that problem. It's you don't know what is true and what is not. Now, many times it's honest mistakes that people do, but when you're dealing with slick productions and things like that, passing something phony as real, then that further creates a problem. So I think I'm running out of time. If I'm not running out of time, we can go back to videotapes and see a couple more, but that's what I thought. We are running out of time. So, thank you very much, and I'll be at my table if you have any questions, and later on at the speaker panel and so on. Thanks. Nobody has seen all of them, because some are very obscure, some come from Russia, and some are not even broadcast shows. They're just raw interviews with cosmonauts and officers. So some of these shows are in English, and I won't say anything, then you can listen by yourself. Some are in Russian, and of course those I will be kind of narrating what you're seeing. So we should get started soon, because we do have a lot of video clips, and then at the end we'll also be showing some slides. And I will be kind of guiding you through this presentation, telling you what you're about to see, and you know, what areas you should be paying attention, and so on. So the first, basically I've divided in 3 sections, well, 4 sections. If we have time, we'll see at the end a couple of more clips. But the main important sections will be the first section. We're going to see a few clips of UFO material dealing with the Russian space program and Russian cosmonauts. You'll see interviews with various Russian cosmonauts about either sightings they've had or you know, their own interest in UFOs, as well as which had been a subject rather repressed during the communist era. And so that was my first presentation that I gave about Russia. I believe later that same year I also gave a presentation for the MUFON Symposium in Pensacola, and that paper you can still get through the proceedings. And later on, I published this book, which unfortunately is out of print now, the study guide in the USSR to psychic and UFOs and paranormal phenomena. And because, like I said, there was a lot of excitement about, suddenly there was a flood of new material coming out of what was then the Soviet Union. And then I remember that on the year after, in the Ozarks in 1991, thanks to my connections, we brought a Russian speaker here, Sergei Bulantsev, a man who was a senior correspondent at the TASS news agency, and he had been a close personal friend and colleague of Professor Ziegel, who is the godfather of Russian ufology, who passed away in 1988. And then to continue this little history of Russian ufology in the Ozarks, I believe it was on the year after, this would have been 92, I guess, or might have been 93, we screened here for the first time big problems we've always had with ufology. So what I want to do in this presentation basically is to talk about, well, a little bit about the phony KGB documents and footage, and then mostly about the real KGB documents and the investigations done by the Soviet Ministry of Defense and the KGB, and which I wrote a long article in the current issue of the Anomalist journal. It's a very good journal that comes twice a year. And this is about what's known as the Usovo case, which was a UFO incident that took place at this intercontinental nuclear missile base in what was still the Soviet Union. Now it's in an independent country, Ukraine. But back in when this incident happened in 1982, that was certainly still part of the Soviet Union, still part of the Cold War. That was pre-Gorbachev. So basically, a lot of this presentation, you won't be hearing me, but you will be hearing Russian people themselves, and mostly retired military officers and KGB people talking from various documentaries, TV documentaries. I've done a montage of a number of shows. I'm sure some of you have seen maybe some of those shows, but I guarantee Thanks, Lou. It's always a pleasure to be here once again. And so let me get organized my papers here. And well, the subject of this time's lecture is going to be Russia. And I don't know how many of you have attended, you know, a lot of these conferences, but I'll give a little bit the history here. And I believe it was at the Ozark Symposium in 1990 that I gave a lecture about Russia. Just out of curiosity, I'd like to know how many of you might have seen that lecture. Raise your hand. Okay, so I guess it'll be new material for, well, in fact, the presentation that I'm going to give today is not going to be at all the same as the one in 1990. Of course, we have 9 years in between. But at that time, there was a lot of excitement about what was still the Soviet Union, because with Gorbachev and Perestroika and Glasnost, a lot of the, well, everything, life and culture in the Soviet Union was opening up, and including UFOs. In the United States, 2 Soviet-Russian documentaries about UFOs done by my friend Dr. Vladimir Avinsky of Samara, Russia. One was called Planet of Aliens, the other one was called UFO Top Secret. Probably there might be some of you who saw that, but again, that was a long time ago. So that's a little bit the history. Of course, in lectures that I gave in subsequent years, I did touch briefly upon some update or other from Russia, but basically I haven't done too much lecturing about Russia since then. You know, like I said, I might have covered 1 or 2 cases. But this year, Lou had asked me to make some comments about that TNT show narrated by Roger Moore, the secret KGB UFO files, which I have quite a negative opinion about it, but we'll see some excerpts, and then I'll explain why I think that program was a hoax. And so I didn't want to spend an hour and a half talking about a hoax. I don't think that's what you people want to hear. Although it's very important to clear the record, you know, and clean the barn and separate the good stuff from the bad stuff, because otherwise ufology becomes a muddled mixture of myth and reality, fact and fiction. And this is one of the